Got it.
Wonderful. Recording. All right,
Recording.
now I'm going to do your lovely introduction.
Okay, great.
We didn't go over your last name beforehand either.
Getman.
Getman, Meta Getman is a donor conception coach who helps family-focused, responsible, and thoughtful women and couples who have found themselves facing a journey to parenthood they had never imagined, using donor eggs, donor sperm, or donor embryo. Through her e-course, The Donor Download, Meta helps her clients go from isolation, loneliness, and fear of the donor process to hope, confidence, and excitement for building their families. Meta and her husband, Michael, went through their own infertility challenges, and after 4 IUIs, 3 rounds of fresh IVF, they achieved their dream of a family through using donor eggs. Meta has been featured in multiple podcasts, has spoken multiple times at the Resolve Midwest Family Building Summit, and a co-founder of a local community where she lives for families who have used donor to have their children. She is passionate about sharing her story and helping others who are exploring or headed down the path of using donor. Welcome to Everlasting Hope, where Zoom likes to give us technical difficulties, apparently.
Thank you.
We're going to dive right in. We're so happy to have you. If you're watching, this will once again be saved to our website and YouTube channel for afterwards. And if you have questions, I will try. I'm going to see if I can watch them on Facebook, but I don't know if it's going to be possible. But leave them there. We'll get back to you one way or another. But let's just dive in. Take it away.
Let's do it. Okay, here we go. This is my first time presenting with Canva, so let's see how this goes. Welcome, everyone. Like Tara said, my name's Meta. It's pronounced Mayda, so I like to say that because it's not spelled the way it's pronounced. I always say I don't set people up for success because it's not spelled the way it's pronounced. Anyway, I am a mom to twin girls who were conceived via donor egg. That is a picture of the 2 of them right there with my husband, Michael. I'm a donor conception coach. I also work full-time for a large Fortune 5 company. I am a proud wife to my husband, Michael. And as Tara said, I'm really passionate about helping others feel heard, seen, and known on their fertility journey. So that is a little bit about me. So I wanted to start tonight by telling you a story. So this picture right here, as fuzzy as it is, was taken when we were going in for our second round of IVF, which failed. And like the first round, we ended up with no embryos to freeze. This was the second time that happened. And it was after this happened that our doctor started talking to us about using a donor. And so for me, the questions started, well, the first response was, there's no way I'm doing that. But then as I thought about it more, my mind started flooding with questions. And if you have been faced with this or are facing this reality, some of these may sound familiar to you. So like, I was terrified and thinking like, would my child even look like me? Would I even feel connected to this child who wasn't created using my own eggs? Would I feel left out from my family because I didn't share genetics with my kids? Would we tell our kids that we used a donor to conceive them? I don't think there's a lot of families that sit around and talk about like, hey, here's how you were conceived, or at least the kids aren't comfortable with that conversation. Would we tell other people that we were using a donor? And what if people found out, like other people, like teachers or their friends, like would they reject my child? And how would we even start talking about this? It was incredibly overwhelming. And honestly, it came down to, I really felt ashamed that we had to use a donor. I was scared. I didn't know anyone else who was using a donor, so I felt incredibly alone. I felt broken, like my body wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. Lost, like I didn't know where I was going, how to navigate this crazy world. I was incredibly disappointed. And I felt let down, but I also felt like I was letting Michael down too, that I couldn't do what I felt like I was supposed to do as his wife. And I truly was stuck in this like fear, and I couldn't move forward. That I was going to let Michael down and that I would never get to be a mom. And that sucked. Like that was a really hard spot for me. Um, so Michael really was my champion and the one who pushed me to say, hey, let's just start exploring this. We don't have to do it if we don't want to, but let's start exploring it. And so I reluctantly said yes. And in order to do that, we had to go see a therapist. And and that therapist really kind of gave us, it was a quick appointment, like maybe an hour, where she essentially gave us all the rundown of everything that we needed to think about, excuse me, when it came to using a donor. But it was during that appointment that I started to realize how much my fear of this unknown world was holding me back from truly moving forward. And she was the first person who really encouraged us to talk about our journey and talk about using a donor. And so it was at that appointment where I started to realize donor conception was just a different path to parenthood. There was nothing right or wrong about it. It just was different and it wasn't what I had thought my path would be. Um, and so what I learned after that appointment and as we continued down the path to donor and found our donor and got pregnant and had our children, and now our children are almost 5. The things that I've learned along this whole story is that donor conception was not as scary as I had originally thought it was. I am not alone, and I'm not the only one who's pursued this as their option to build their family. Um, my children are not labeled as donor conceived. The people who know are incredibly supportive, and the majority of people in their life don't know because they don't need to know. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a little bit. And that ultimately my goals in building our family were I wanted to be a mom and I wanted to experience pregnancy, and donor conception was the best way for us to do that. And so I became confident in this decision to use a donor. At first, I was not confident. Um, but then that confidence slowly turned into this excitement and hope for what our family was going to be. So tonight, I just wanted to cover a few things really high level, just some of the emotions that I went through and that people go through when they're looking at using a donor to build their family, talking about just some of the practical steps or like what does that process actually look like. I do want to touch on talking about donor conception with your child, your donor conceived child, and also with friends and family and people in your life. And then I just have some suggestions of where you can find some resources for help if this is a path you want to go down. So my goal for you is that after you see our presentation or after you walk away tonight, that you'll really feel like donor conception is maybe not as scary as you thought it was. So let's talk a little bit about the emotions related to donor conception. So infertility is incredibly challenging. I think we all know that. That feels very easy to say that when infertility in itself is incredibly complex and difficult and challenging in every aspect of our lives. And then for me, and I think for a lot of people, donor complexion adds a whole new layer of complexity and a whole new layer of emotions that we don't necessarily have to experience when we're just using our own genetics to build our family. And so, like I mentioned, some of the things that I felt, the emotions that people can feel when they're going through donor conception is really shame, right? Feeling shameful that they have to ask for help. I'm the kind of person who I do not like asking for help. I don't even like asking for help like cleaning my house. Like I don't like asking for help like moving boxes, let alone asking for help to like have a baby. And so I felt a lot of shame and I felt a lot of guilt around that too. Like guilty that maybe I was impacting the donor in a way that I shouldn't, or guilty that maybe if my body wouldn't create the eggs that I needed, that maybe I shouldn't be a parent or I shouldn't be a mom, or I shouldn't get to experience pregnancy because if I was meant to, then my eggs would work. And so just kind of working through some of those feelings. Like I mentioned, I felt incredibly broken. My body wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. I didn't know anyone, so I felt really alone and I was isolated. And those feelings of being alone and isolation also came from some of the community that I had built going through infertility, because my friends in the infertility community who were having success with IVF or IUI using their own genetics, they didn't understand that like next layer of complexity where I was truly grieving the loss of being able to use my own genetics. And it felt incredibly isolating. And so, I just mentioned like the grief aspect, and I had a lot of grief and I didn't know it at the time that that's how I was feeling, but I really was sad about losing my genetics. I was convinced that I would never have a blue-eyed child. I was convinced that I'd never have a blonde-haired child because our donor had brown hair and brown eyes. I didn't really I didn't think that I'd be able to pass along my family's double chin like I had always thought that I would. Um, and at the time, those were really hard things. Now, I don't think about those things at all. My children look exactly the way that I think they're meant to look. And I think a lot of them, they share qualities of me. Both of my children have blue eyes, even though our donor and Michael both have brown eyes. And one of my children has better blonde hair than I do. So, I was worried about that. And I did spend time grieving that loss. And I think also, along with that and infertility, I was grieving just the normal things that people get to do when they're trying to have a baby. Like having sex with my husband was not fun, right? We all have been there. Or even like getting to surprise the people that are closest to me that were pregnant. They were part of the process with us. They knew we were going through the IVF process. They knew we were having our transfer. They knew when our first beta was. And so we never got to do that like, haha, surprise, we're pregnant kind of thing. Um, and then I think it was just grieving a lot of the losses around knowing all the things that could go wrong, right? Losing that naivete, if you will, about getting pregnant and having a baby that like were just gone for me. And that was hard too. But I think the most important thing of all of this is these feelings that we all have are they are true and they are real. And it's really important that we recognize what those feelings are so that we can work through them and not carry them into parenting. And I was able to do that. We ended up having to wait about 6 months from the time that we chose our donor, or that we decided to use donor, until we actually got a donor. And during those 6 months, I really just did a lot of work on myself personally, kind of working through that grief, processing, why we were choosing to use a donor, what things were important to us, and how did donor fit into that. Becoming confident in our decision to use a donor. All of those things we took time and energy to work through, but were incredibly important so that when we came out on the other side with our children, we didn't bring that baggage into our parenting. And I'm so glad we spent the time doing that. And that's one of the things I like to talk about with my clients too, is just working through some of those things. So I don't know, Tara, are there any questions so far? Can you see any questions? I'm kind of just plowing through, but I'm happy to pause if I need to.
Keep going. I'll check real quick, but you keep going.
Okay, interrupt me if there are any questions, okay?
Okay.
Okay, cool. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, just really high level, are just some of the steps around donor conception. So it's pretty basic. You basically have 3 steps when it comes to donor conception. And if you've gone through an IUI treatment or if you've gone through an IVF cycle, you pretty much know what it's like. It's just different because you're using, maybe for an IUI, you're using donor sperm, or for an IVF cycle, you're using a donor egg that's been inseminated with your partner's sperm, You can also do double donor where you're using donor egg and donor sperm, or you're doing a transfer with a donor embryo. But I'll talk about that in a sec. So the first thing you got to do is decide on your donor. The second thing you got to do is find your donor and then go through the treatment process. So deciding to use a donor, I think truly is the hardest step in the process. And I think it's the step that really deserves the time to make that decision and come to a conclusion that you and your partner feel incredibly confident about. So I like to break it down in a couple steps. And the first step is truly trying to figure out what are your own values in life? Like what matters to you in your life? What matters to you in your relationship? Because in our lives, our values are what drive us, right? They're the things that help us make decisions, that help us feel good about what we're choosing to do in our life, how we're living our lives. And so I think it's important to recognize, like, what are our values? And there aren't right values or wrong values. There's just who we are and how we're made and how we live our life. But we're not going to feel confident in our decision to use a donor if our decision isn't centered in our values. And so that's one of the things that I think is really, really important. The second one is really around, what are my goals for family building and my life? So donor is not the right step for everyone, just like adoption isn't the right step for everyone, or living child-free isn't the right step for everyone. Like, everyone needs to come to the conclusion of what their ultimate goals are and what they want to have their life be. So for Michael and I, like, one of our goals was we wanted to have a family if we could. That was a goal. I really wanted to experience pregnancy, and I knew from our treatment process that my body was able to do that. We didn't want to go bankrupt. We didn't want to spend all of our money and kind of come out on the other end completely penniless through going through these infertility treatments. And we didn't want to ruin our marriage or our relationship in the process. And so those were kind of the four things that drove us forward to making the decision to use a donor. Because I wanted to experience pregnancy, donor egg would allow me the opportunity to try that. We wanted to have a baby, donor egg was going to help us do that. For us, donor egg was kind of the easier to plan for financial process or financial decision. So we were able to plan for that more so than we were for some other things. And we both agreed that using a donor was going to be the next step. So it kind of ticked the marks on all of our goals, which all aligned to our values of our marriage was one, like our strong relationship is one of our values. Family, like being very family oriented, sharing and passing on traditions were part of our values. And also just being authentic and true to who we were, or who we are, I guess. And so once you kind of figure out what are your values and what are your goals in family building, what are your goals in life, like, you kind of ask the question, does donor conception fit into those things? Does donor conception feel like the right answer for us? And if the answer is yes, great. And if the answer is no, then doing some more thought process and working through that more, working through it with a therapist, working through it with a coach, like, all of those things are good next steps. So, okay, that work can take a little time. And I think it's important just for me to make the comment of, it's okay to pause your process. It's okay to take the time that you need in order to feel comfortable moving forward with using a donor. Because here's the deal, and I think you already know this, but I'm just gonna say it. Once you decide to use a donor and you actually get pregnant using a donor, like you're locked in. Like there's no changing your mind, right? So it's important that before you move forward, you're feeling really good about that decision. And the other thing about it too is about the time piece is that the timelines that you're feeling, like those are your own timelines. No one is putting a timeline on you, right? So if you feel like you need to stop and take a couple months to really just process and think and get your head in the right place, like that is okay. And I really encourage people to do that. And honestly, like the 6 months that we were forced to wait for our donor were probably the most valuable 6 months that we had in our whole entire journey because it gave me the space and it gave us the space to reconnect as a couple, to work through the things that we had been through, to process and get ready to use a donor. So I'm a huge just advocate for taking a pause if you need it to really get in the right space. Okay, so once you've decided like, yep, we're going to use a donor, donor's the right step for me. Really, there's technically 4 donor options. I put 3 on here, mostly because the 4th option is double donor, donor egg and donor sperm, and you find your donor egg and you find your donor sperm the same way. So with donor egg, there's a couple ways that you can go about finding a donor. You can use your clinic's donor program if your clinic has one. Usually the selection is less in a clinic donor program. Usually you have less control over who you get to pick in a clinic donor program, but it's a great option. It's what we chose. We used our clinic donor program. So that's a way that you can find a donor. Another option is going through one of the egg banks. So Donor Egg Bank USA is one, Fairfax Egg Bank is one, My Donor Egg Bank I think is another one. They're nationally known in the United States for being really good. Going through those, a lot of times it's kind of like Match.com, honestly, where you sign up with them and then you can scroll through donor profiles and read all about them and see photos and all that kind of stuff. Typically with the donor egg banks, you buy a lot of eggs. So you buy like 6 eggs or 8 eggs or 12 eggs at a time. And then a third option is known donor. So known donor would fall under the category of like you have a cousin who maybe wants to donate their eggs or a sister who might be willing to donate their eggs. Known donor is great. There are a lot of things to consider when using a known donor. Consider for the donor themselves, for you, for your family, how you talk to your child about it, how there's legal aspects. So it's a little bit more, it's not kind of an all-in-one package. You have to kind of go out and find a fertility lawyer and draft up documents and stuff like that. But known donor can also be amazing because you can say use a cousin's eggs or a sister's eggs and be able to continue to have some of your family's genetics as part of your child. So there's pluses and minuses for both options. For donor sperm, again, you could use a known donor. So asking a family member, a brother-in-law, someone like that to donate to you. Also, there's the sperm banks, and those are pretty well known. The cryobanks that are out there are pretty well known. Again, you buy vials of sperm. That's kind of how it works. And then with sperm donor, you can either do IUI, so intrauterine insemination, or you can do an IVF with the ICSI and the ART, where you are taking the donor sperm and you're taking one sperm and you're putting it into the egg in a lab. So there's a couple ways to use donor sperm. Like I mentioned, double donor is where you would pick an egg donor and you would pick a sperm donor and you would have those materials sent to your clinic and then they would combine the two in the lab. I know some people who have used that option as well. And then last but not least, there's donor embryo. So it's interesting. I was in a Facebook group, I don't know, maybe last week or something like that. And someone said, are there people even out there who'd want want embryos, donor embryos, if we donated our embryos? And the answer to that question is yes. There are a lot of couples out there who would love to have donor embryos. So people who use donor embryos maybe have both, male and female factor infertility. Maybe they have genetic traits in their family that they don't want to pass down. And so they want to use a donor embryo. Sometimes people choose to use a donor embryo because if they can't use one person's genetics, they don't want to use either person's genetics. There's a lot of reasons for using donor embryo, but donor embryo is an amazing option for a lot of people. So again, clinics can have donor embryo programs, or there are donor embryo banks. So either way. One other note I would just want to say about donor embryo is I personally use the term donor embryo. You will hear out there the term embryo adoption, and it's really they can be used interchangeably, donor embryo or embryo adoption. It's just there are some donor embryo banks where they truly treat the placement of the embryos like an adoption. So like doing a home study, and the couple who has the embryos choose the couple that they want those embryos to go to. And it's more of an open adoption situation versus a donor embryo, like a donor where you get to pick the couple. Like the choice is more in the intended parents or the people who are choosing the embryo. But both are mutually exclusive. They work together. They're the same. And just wanted to mention that if you see that out there, it's the same. Donor embryo and donor adoption are the same. Okay, so really quick, the last step is really you go through your treatment process. So going through donor egg or donor embryo cycle is very similar to going through a frozen embryo cycle or an FET. You would prepare your body, you would do the shots, you would take the medicines, you would have the monitoring for yourself, have the blood draws, and then instead of going through a retrieval, you skip right over to the transfer part. They transfer in the donor egg that's been combined with your partner's sperm that's created an embryo, or they transfer in the donor embryo. And then you have the dreaded 2-week wait, and you go from there. With donor sperm, it can vary. So it depends on your diagnosis and what your doctor's recommending for treatment. Some patients will do IUI with the vials of donor sperm, or you can go and do IVF as well. So it's really dependent on what your situation is and what your doctor recommends. But honestly, once you get to that point, it's basically exactly like what you've been doing. So it's pretty straightforward. So the last thing I just wanted to mention and talk about is talking about donor conception. So if you follow me, if you hear me talk, I am 150% an advocate for talking to your kids and talking to the people in your kid's life about the fact that you used a donor. And really quickly, like historically, parents were advised against telling their children. So for a very long time, like up until the 90s, most doctors would recommend to people who were using any kind of donor to build their family that they should not tell their children that they used a donor. And the intent and the belief at the time was that this would protect children from emotional and relational distress. And we know now that that is not the case. That is not true. So this chart that I have here is from the 2020 We Are Donor Conceived survey. So there's an amazing organization out there called We Are Donor Conceived, and it's for donor conceived persons. And every year they do a survey of donor conceived persons just to understand their thoughts around being donor conceived, their feelings about it, the impact that being donor conceived has had on their lives. And they provide really great research and information to help not only donor conceived persons kind of navigate through life in this way, but also helping people like me who are parenting donor conceived children make sure that I'm doing the best for my kids and helping them understand what this means for them. But I think this chart is fascinating in that you can see like there was a very, very low percentage of people who were told that as a child or an infant that they were conceived using a donor. Up until the 90s and into the early 2000s is when we really saw that jump. And the reason why it's so incredibly important to talk to your children about the fact that they're donor conceived is there's a lot of reasons, but I think some of the core ones is that it is best for the child. It can be hard as the parents, especially if you haven't worked through your feelings of shame and guilt and sadness and loss around using your own genetics, to want to hold on to that information and not share it. But it truly is the best for the child because it impacts them. The other thing is that it models honesty and trustworthiness, and it establishes a foundation of trust going forward. We all want to have that with our families, right? With our kids. We all want our kids to trust us. Being open and honest about this piece of who they are is incredibly important for developing that trust. And it also supports the attachment process. And when I say the attachment process, I mean the process that children and their parents go through as they begin to develop that parent and child relationship. And it really does support healthy development in the child. It also deepens your understanding of what it means to be a to parent a donor conceived child. Again, like I said, this is about them and this is about their story. And yes, it's the path that I chose, right, to have them, but it does impact them. And when I'm able to come to the point where I'm really comfortable talking about it with them, it has helped me understand where they could be coming from and what it means to be their mom and help them navigate this part of their life. It also builds your confidence and comfort in using a donor, in your decision to use a donor, because you have to work through all of those feelings and emotions. And then it also gives you control of the narrative, right? So you get to decide what you tell, who you tell, how you tell. You get to ask them how you want them to use the information. And it really gives you as a family that control. And so one of the things I like to talk about with my clients a lot is the difference between a secret and privacy, right? Because not everyone needs to know that your child is donor conceived or that you used a donor to have your child. But there are some people who do need to know. So I like to look at it this way. A secret is when you are withholding information from view, where you don't share it with anyone, not even people who need to know. Secrets are usually have shame behind them. Secrets usually always come out, and they always come out in a way that's not healthy and not good. Whereas being private or having privacy is where you're withholding information from view and you're only sharing it with those who need to know. So when you think about it from the perspective of using a donor, you can be private, but not secret. And not everyone needs to know this information. So I like to consider it this way. If you think about like, who should I tell that we're using a donor? I like to put in front of it, is the information, about using a donor important to this relationship at this time? Right? So if you say like, should I tell my child that I used a donor to conceive them? Well, would that information about your child be important to them in your parent-child relationship at that time? The answer is 100% yes, it would be. But if you think about it from like, should I tell Uncle Joe that I used a donor. Well, what would be important why would Uncle Joe need to know? He probably doesn't need to know. So then it wouldn't be important and he wouldn't need to know. Your child's pediatrician probably needs to know. Your child's daycare provider, maybe, maybe not. You have to make that decision. For Michael and I, when we really thought about who are we going to tell this information to, for us, it came down to who is going to be in our child's life that we want to know. And when our child got old enough, or our children got old enough to start talking about it on their own, when our child ran up to someone in our family and said, hey, mom and dad used a special lady to help me be created, we wanted that person to say, like grandma, we wanted grandma to say, or auntie to say, yes, isn't that so cool that someone helped your mom and dad have you? Versus, no, that's not true. What are you talking about? Right? Because then that could communicate that maybe we were trying to hide something or we weren't happy about our decision. So those are just some of the things I like to think about when I consider who do you tell and who do you talk to about it. There's a lot more that goes into this. I actually have like a whole webinar on it. So this is just really kind of touching the surface, but these are some of the key points that I really wanted to make sure that you guys heard. So really quick, just wanted to share a couple resources, and I can give Tara the links to some of these places, but children's books are an amazing resource if you're using a donor or thinking about using a donor to build your family. There are a lot of books out there, and I'm happy to make some recommendations for you of some series that are great that I love. But children's books these authors have done the most amazing job of taking this incredibly emotionally charged, complex topic and breaking it down into really easy language and words to understand that you can not only share with your kids, but is also a great way to help start forming how to talk about it in your own head. So I recommend to the people that I work with that, like, if they're choosing to use donor sperm, I recommend that they go buy one or two of these children's books before they even get started. And they start reading the books themselves, because it really helps you get down to the simplest language that you can use to start learning and understanding what this means. And then these books are an incredible resource for starting to talk to your kids about it early and often. So we have every book that I recommend we have, and they are part of the rotation. They have been in our kids' rooms since they were born. And we pull them out from time to time, but they also pick them from time to time too. So they're a great, great way to start talking to your kids about it. There's also some great books that I recommend for you as an adult, where that are great to start learning and processing the whole donor conception process. So 3 Makes Baby by Jana Rupnow is excellent. I've read it multiple times. She also just came out with a great companion workbook that goes with it. She's also wonderful to follow on Instagram. She just has some really great resources, and I love recommending her. And then a new book that just came out is called Flipping the Script on Infertility. It's by Kezia Okafor. And Kezia is from the UK, and she just does a really, really good job in this book helping you break down the emotional aspects of infertility and really working through those emotional pieces that I talked about. It's focused on infertility in general, but you can definitely use it for processing through donor too. And then last, the Donor Conception Network out of the UK. They've got some amazing resources, children's books, and also kind of like pamphlet books for adults as well, just about, using a donor, talking and telling, sharing your story, all of those things. And you can get those on their website or on Amazon. And then lastly, a couple podcasts that I love. I love Tara's podcast, so I highly recommend that one. But also Jana Rupnow has a 3 Makes Baby podcast, which is all focused on donor. She does a great job of sharing not only stories of people like me who have donor conceived children, but she also shares great stories from donor conceived persons and stuff like that. And then if you want to hear more about my story, I did a great podcast with Robin Birkin on the Fertility Warrior podcast that I would recommend as well. And then last but not least, I have a free resource on my website. Feel free to go check it out. It's called the Essential Donor Checklist, and it's a couple pages of questions that I recommend that you think through as you're considering using donor, that you can talk to your provider about, questions to ask your provider about, questions to think about when you think about choosing a donor. It's just a great resource for you to use as well as you consider that. And it's totally free. So head over to my website and grab that. And then I just have to quick mention my 6-week course, which is called the Donor Down Low, where we really spend 6 weeks diving into these things that I've been talking about tonight, the emotional aspects of using a donor, getting comfortable sharing your story, choosing to use a donor, the process of going through donor. We dig into some of the, some epigenetics, how our genes are impacted by pregnancy and all of that. So would recommend that as well. So thank you for joining me. I'm hoping there's a couple questions I can answer. But if you're not already following me, I would love to see you on Instagram at Meta Getman. I'm always open. Feel free to ask questions, send me a DM. Happy to help. Really, truly, I want to be here for other people. So I love interacting. So please ask me. Come follow me. And
okay, I got one question for you, Meta.
One question. Okay.
In regards to services nowadays like Ancestry.com,
Yeah.
I'm going to see if I can pull them up. So the question is, although we're open to discussing, I question the anonymous donor since they chose to keep private originally. They would inevitably get linked if both using the service. They're becoming more popular than they were. So she just was curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So that is one of the reasons why anonymous donor really is kind of a farce these days, if you will, because and unfortunately, unfortunately, a lot of donor conceived persons are finding out that they're donor conceived because like their friends made a bet with them to do 23andMe, like because they were trying to have fun. And then like this life-changing bomb got dropped on them when their 23andMe came back. And that's just devastating, right? So so here's full transparency. Michael and I used an anonymous donor. We don't know our donor. Looking back, if I had known more or had done more research, I probably would have picked a donor that we could have either known who they were, not like a sister or a cousin or someone like that, but we would have been able to know the identity, or someone that we knew was guaranteed to be open for identification at age 18. So when your child turns 18, they're able to contact the donor if they want to. And I think the world is moving more in that direction, in less doing anonymous and more into the ID or known donor, being able to know who your donor is, merely for the fact because it is so easy now to figure out who your like where your genes are coming from through these services. And I think as we continue to move forward, it's going to be easier and easier for us to do that. And have DNA tests and have those gene mapping and all of that that's coming from a technology perspective in healthcare. So that is also another reason why I am a huge proponent of talking to your kids very early on and often about the fact that they're donor conceived, because you don't want them to find out through 23andMe. You want them to find it out from you, and you want it to be something that when someone asks them, maybe when they're 18 or 20 or in their adulthood, and they say like, well, what was it like when you found out that you were donor conceived? Their answer is, well, I've always known. There was never a moment that I found out. It just was something that I've always known about me. So those are my thoughts on that topic. It's a
Love
good
it. That's good. I know. Well, that's all there is, but
one. Okay.
we'll put your information as well in the comments. And you are so easy to find and talk to. So thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I am like, oh, people need to do your course. That would be so good. I think it's just one of those things where you can surround yourself with solid support and information. It's almost a no-brainer in my opinion, especially when you're walking through something like this.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's why I created it, was because there was nothing like that when I was going through the process, and I just felt like I would go down this crazy Google rabbit hole of like
Absolutely.
scary stories or things that I didn't know, like, is this real or not real? Like, what's scientifically based, what's not? And so I'm really trying to help like curate and bring that information together so that, like, the information that I'm giving you and the resources that I'm directing you to are like sound, scientifically based, like true, real resources that are good. So
it's
anyway.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for hanging with the technical glitches. You're actually
totally.
she's running the show. I had to
I am running
apparently
the show.
You cannot do Zoom stream from a phone. If anyone is curious to know that fact, you cannot apparently stream live to Facebook from a phone Zoom meeting. So there's that. But join us all tomorrow morning, everyone, at 10:30. We have our wonderful 5-lady panel, a diverse group of infertility patients. It's going to be solid information, a time for you to connect with others. So make sure to join us. And thank you again, Meta, so much. We appreciate having you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye, everyone.
Bye.